Okay, welcome to EDCON 2020. Thank you all for showing up, given the circumstances. There's a lot going on. Hopefully this talk will be really useful for people that have not really followed what Gitcoin is up to with quadratic funding. For those of you who are already familiar with what we're doing, I apologize in advance. Some of this might be a bit redundant, but hopefully this will be a good starting explainer for people that aren't really aware of the concept or sort of the history of it. So what is quadratic funding? First and foremost, quadratic funding is economics. It is a paper that was written by Vitalik and Zoe Hitzig and Glenn Whale. And Vitalik kind of came at this from the Ethereum perspective, while Glenn Whale came at it from the radical exchange perspective. And they both kind of brought, I think, very different but complementary ideas to this. Vitalik more on the mechanism design side, and then Glenn more on the formal economic side. And I think that between them, they were really able to come up with an interesting idea for funding public goods. That's really what the paper is trying to talk about in large part. And the idea, of course, that they came up with was quadratic funding. And the formula that they sort of chose initially, which we've sort of iterated on with Vitalik's help since then, is this one here. And what this says is that you want to take the square of the sum of square roots of contributions, and you want to match those to some sort of group of individual contributions. And the reason this is so important is because you don't really have a one-to-one dollar-based matching system. Instead, you have the ability for individual donors to actually signal their interest in a project, and potentially, by getting more people engaged in that project, increase the matching amount and increase the amount that's available to that project. So it's almost, and I think we'll get to this a bit later, a more democratic way to actually fund public goods. And that's the key insight, is that it is an optimal, economically optimal, but also democratic way to fund public goods. And more than that, more practically, it's a way to distribute a matching pool to set projects. It's a way to get $50 matching for a $1 donation. And as a result, it's about incentives. We're trying to figure out, how do we get people to build things and fund things that are in their long-term interest or in the community's long-term interest, but not necessarily in their own immediate interest, right? And you can kind of imagine this in standard economic terms. There's this heuristic function or utility function, and people are really good at optimizing their immediate needs and immediate wants. And that's what this function here represents. They're not as good at optimizing these longer term needs and wants. So how do we get them to actually make those trade-offs? How do we get them to think about the actual intersection between these and think about the long-term landscape? And the way that we feel that sort of quadratic funding helps with this is by really making sure that people think about the kind of outsized benefit they could have in funding public goods. And we want people to really think about this in the context of having a say in public good funding. And why should I participate in this sort of process? Well, because you actually will have real impact on where this goes and who gets funded, and you actually feel like you're invested in a sense. So when we talk about public goods, though, what do we mean, right? So there's a lot of confusion about this, and I think the biggest piece of confusion comes from club goods. So something like and actually I have parks here twice, but there are private parks and there are public parks. But there's, for example, individual private groups, cinemas, things like satellite TV. These are things that an individual person or group can block you out of. If it's owned by a company, if it's owned by an individual, they can decide that they don't want you to be part of those. But public goods are not excludable. You cannot actually prevent someone from being involved in, breathing clean air or using roads and bridges, so long as they are public in sort of the true sense, right? I mean, the key here to note is that there are public and private versions of a lot of these things. But the other thing to note, by the way, is that there's this idea of things being scarce or things being sort of open. So there's no such, shortage of clean air, at least in certain parts of the world. If you are in that part of the world, you have access to clean air. It's not quite the same with fish or with timber or with coal or natural gas. Those are things that are, of course, possible to run out of at a given point in time. So ultimately, when you can run out of things, when you can overuse things, you run into this tragedy of the commons, which we see with pollution, we see with declining or degrading infrastructure, and we see with kind of the rise of what a lot of people are calling like surveillance capitalism, where people don't have control over their data or how they manage their funds or how they manage any kind of real like digital good. And that to me is one of the problems that I think we're doing a really good job in particular in solving. So the question is, how do we get more of these? How do we get more of these things that we all benefit from and that really matter to us, but that aren't in our like short-term interest to focus on, and that can potentially be, I guess, like easily overlooked or kind of overrun if we're not careful. And so I think in this way, quadratic funding is prescient. Like the public goods funding problem in general is a much broader problem than we realize. And the idea that, you know, quadratic funding presents is really compelling because people are actually, it's one of the few things out there that really talks about how can we, without a centralized body, get people to participate in this process and to be really engaged in actually, you know, their long-term communities and their long-term interests. And so, you know, historically we haven't been very good at this, right? I mean, like you go back all the way to like hunter-gatherer tribes, we were very much focused on our immediate needs, our immediate surroundings. With agriculture, we started to understand a bit better, you know, what was needed to at least at like kind of a yearly basis, build our communities and build our resources. And then in the industrial age, we sort of decided this makes sense to do it at scale, which of course had a lot of externalities associated with it. And in the information age, I don't think we've really realized what those externalities are yet. And we're just sort of coming to terms with the fact that data has these sorts of pernicious effects in the same sort of, you know, maybe slightly different format relative to, say, oil. And so we think Ethereum is a coordination machine that can actually really help us with this process. Apologies for the background noise, just given the area I'm in. But I think Ethereum really can be a major part of this like solution. And I think quadratic funding in the Ethereum context can be in particular one of the things that drives this overall idea forward. And in some ways, the idea is more important than an individual implementation. The point is that we need people to actually care about long-term funding and long-term sustainability of public goods, and that requires a lot of public discussion about these things. So we can imagine sort of crypto itself in Web3 as a city, and we can imagine that we have our own infrastructure, we have our own data, we have our own communities, we have our own local sort of businesses that we work with and support. And these things need to be sustained in some way too. But the difference between crypto cities and sort of like Web 2 digital infrastructure is that we actually have like currencies. We have our own local community currencies that we can use to actually fund these goods. And those are generated and powered by our communities. They're not powered by external factors that are beyond our control. And so I think that's a really key difference between where we are now and why this is so relevant to where we are today. Quadratic funding works because we actually have control over the underlying kind of tools and like currencies that we're using in that process itself. That's something that didn't happen 20 years ago, or wasn't even really possible 20 years ago without a centralized body to manage that. And so it's happening now. It's something we're working on very actively. And it's something that we've been really proud of in terms of the overall impact in the community. So a few projects that we've funded to date include Week in Ethereum, shout out Evan Van Ness, Tornado Cash, and Radical Exchange, which of course was one of the organizations that really started this movement. And you know, Radical Exchange in particular, I think is an amazing organization that everyone should sort of try to support. That's just my own personal belief and pitch. I think there's a lot of features that we have to add here, but one of the ones I like in particular is the DAI matching. So you have the ability to actually locate, you know, or like pinpoint how much am I actually going to be able to give to this project in total out of the matching pool if I'm part of this. We do need to probably optimize these matching amounts to some extent. They're a bit at times, especially earlier in the rounds, like imprecise. But I think they're a really good way to give you a picture of what the actual value and like long-term impact of quadratic funding is. So how do we get to this like, you know, end game where quadratic funding powers the world? It's iteration and data. We need more data about how people are attacking the system. We need more data about how people are funding businesses. And we need to grow the number of contributions so that there's more signal in each individual round. And so in round one, we raised 38,000. In round two, we raised 56,000. And now in round six, we raised over 227,000 with over 10,000 contributions during what was effectively a bear market. And so I've been really excited about, you know, this driving completion of Gitcoin's broader mission, which is to grow and sustain open source software. And that to me starts in Web3. So really fundamentally, we want people to work for the open internet. I want people to work for the open internet. And I think that quadratic funding is a way for us to get people there. So if you have questions or comments about how we're doing this, please reach out, either scott@gitcoin.co or founders@gitcoin.co. We would love to answer any questions about this. For anyone who's already involved, hit us up. We're going to be doing another round in September, and we would love to have you involved either as matching partners or if your project needs funding, have you involved in the round itself. So really, I just want to say again, thanks to the community for supporting us in this. We hope that quadratic funding can really be a core part of solving these public goods funding problems. And we hope to see you in round 7.